There is an invisible architecture that holds up our world, a set of rules, codes, and agreements that govern everything we do. We are born into it. We live our lives within it, and most of us will never once question its foundations. It dictates the price of our food, the value of our homes, the weight of our dreams. We call this architecture money. We work for it, we save it, we fight over it, we trust it. But what if the central pillar of this entire structure was removed in the middle of the night? What if the promise that gave it meaning was broken and replaced with something else entirely? What if the money in your wallet, in your bank account, isn't an asset, but an IOU with no one left to pay it back? The story of our modern world isn't one of slow, steady evolution. It's the story of a single, secret decision. A forgotten law that was erased from the books, and in its place, a system was born that still controls the flow of global wealth today. For thousands of years, money was tied to something real, something tangible, finite, and difficult to create. It was a physical anchor, a promise of discipline. It forced nations, like individuals, to live within their means. But 50 years ago, that anchor was quietly cut. In a single moment, the nature of money was fundamentally changed. The promise was broken. This event didn't just create a new economic system. It created a new reality. It unleashed the era of permanent debt, of dizzying booms and catastrophic busts. It fueled the rise of financial markets that dwarfed the real economy and widened the chasm between the ultra-wealthy and everyone else. How did this happen? How did one decision, made by a handful of men behind closed doors, redefine the very concept of wealth and value for every single person on the planet? And what happens to a world built on a promise that everyone has forgotten was ever made? To find the beginning of the promise, we have to go back to the end of a world. The year is 1944. Civilization is in ashes. The Second World War has torn continents apart, leaving behind a landscape of ruin and a legacy of economic chaos. The great powers of the pre-war era were bankrupt, their currencies shattered by hyperinflation and mistrust. A new order was needed, a new foundation for peace and prosperity. In the quiet mountains of New Hampshire, at a grand hotel in a town called Bretton Woods, delegates from 44 allied nations gathered. They were not just there to sign a treaty, they were there to build a new world from the rubble of the old. They sought stability. They sought a system that would prevent the kind of economic warfare and competitive currency devaluations that had helped pave the road to war. At the center of this gathering stood two towering figures of the 20th century, the brilliant, confident American delegate Harry Dexter White and the legendary British economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes envisioned a truly international system with a new global currency, the Bancor, managed by a world central bank. It was a radical idea, designed to balance the interests of creditor and debtor nations alike. But the United States had a different vision. America emerged from the war not broken, but stronger than ever. Its industries were untouched, its economy booming. And crucially, it held over 2/3 of the entire world's monetary gold, locked away in the vaults of Fort Knox. The American proposal was simpler, and it placed the United States at the very heart of the new global system. The US dollar would become the world's reserve currency. It would be the benchmark against which all other currencies were measured. But this was not just a matter of trust in America's economic might. It was a matter of a sacred, unbreakable promise. The United States government guaranteed that the US dollar was, and always would be, as good as gold. Any central bank, at any time, could exchange its dollars for physical gold at a fixed rate. $35 for 1 troy ounce. This was the bedrock of the Bretton Woods system. The dollar was the sun, and all other currencies were planets orbiting it, held in place by the gravitational pull of gold. For other nations, it meant their money had a stable value. For the world, it meant a predictable system for international trade. For America, it was an immense privilege. It could buy goods from around the world with paper money it printed itself, because that paper was believed to be a direct claim on real, physical gold. The promise was made. The system was born. And for a generation, it worked. The post-war world saw an unprecedented economic boom. Europe and Japan were rebuilt. Global trade flourished. An age of stability and shared prosperity seemed to have dawned. The dollar was king, and its kingdom was built on a foundation of solid gold. But a privilege, especially an exorbitant one, can become a temptation. And by the 1960s, America was beginning to spend beyond its means. The nation was fighting two wars at once: a hot war in the jungles of Vietnam and a domestic war on poverty through the Great Society programs. Both were colossally expensive. To pay for the guns and the butter, the United States government did what governments always do when their ambitions outstrip their income. It printed money. Millions upon millions of new dollars flowed from the printing presses in Washington and into the global economy. At first, the world barely noticed, but slowly, the cracks began to show. The sheer volume of dollars circulating outside the United States began to swell, far exceeding the value of the gold stored in Fort Knox. The promise was becoming mathematically impossible to keep. Across the Atlantic, one leader saw the danger clearly. French President Charles de Gaulle was a fierce nationalist who resented America's growing dominance. He saw the Bretton Woods system not as a partnership, but as an instrument of American financial power. He argued that by printing excess dollars, the U.S. was effectively exporting its inflation, forcing other countries to subsidize its foreign policy and domestic spending. The French called it America's exorbitant privilege, and de Gaulle decided to challenge it directly. He began to systematically cash in France's dollar reserves for gold. It wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a political statement. He would send the French Navy across the ocean to pick up the gold bars, a theatrical gesture designed to expose the system's weakness. France was calling America's bluff. Other countries soon followed suit. Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands. A quiet, steady bank run on the United States Treasury was beginning. The mountain of gold in Fort Knox started to shrink. In 1950, the U.S. held nearly 25,000 tons of gold. By the late 1960s, that number had been cut in half, and it was still falling. Panic began to ripple through the world's central banks. The anchor was slipping. The system was under immense strain. Washington tried to stop the bleeding. It applied diplomatic pressure. It created complex financial instruments to discourage gold conversions. But it could not stop the fundamental problem. It was issuing more promises than it could ever hope to honor. The world was losing faith in the dollar. By the summer of 1971, the situation had reached a crisis point. Britain requested to convert $3 billion into gold, a sum the U.S. simply could not afford to lose. The decades-long balancing act was about to collapse. The promise was about to be broken. The second weekend of August, 1971. While the country was distracted by summer holidays, a secret meeting was convened. President Richard Nixon gathered his top 15 economic advisors at the secluded presidential retreat of Camp David. The mood was tense. They were trapped. The global financial system, the architecture of post-war prosperity, was coming apart at the seams. They faced a stark choice. Option 1 was to defend the dollar and honor the Bretton Woods promise. This would mean a brutal economic shock. They would have to raise interest rates dramatically, slash government spending, and deliberately trigger a deep recession. It would mean immense pain for ordinary Americans, and it was political suicide. It was the path of discipline. Option 2 was unthinkable. it was to abandon the promise altogether, to unilaterally sever the dollar's final link to gold, to default on the solemn pledge made to the world in 1944. It would mean upending the entire global monetary order and entering a world of pure uncertainty. It was the path of escape. For 3 days they debated. The traditionalists, like Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, argued for defending the promise. They warned that cutting the cord to gold would unleash chaos, rampant inflation, and a collapse of trust in America. The pragmatists, led by Treasury Secretary John Connally, a bold and persuasive Texan, argued for the unthinkable. He told Nixon that foreign leaders were screwing us and that it was time to look after ourselves. He framed it not as a default, but as a bold act of American strength. On the evening of Sunday, August 15th, Nixon made his decision. He would not sacrifice his political future to save the old system. He would choose escape. That night, he addressed the nation on live television. Most Americans expected a speech about his new economic policy to fight inflation and unemployment. He announced a 90-day freeze on wages and prices. He announced a 10% surcharge on imports. And then, almost casually, he delivered the final, world-altering blow. He announced he had directed the Treasury Secretary to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily. It was a carefully chosen word, designed to soften the shock, to suggest a brief pause, a technical adjustment. But everyone in that room at Camp David, and every central banker around the world, knew what it really meant. It was not temporary. It was permanent. In that moment, the Bretton Woods system was dead. The gold standard was over. The promise was officially and irrevocably broken. With a single televised speech, the President of the United States had changed the nature of money. From that night forward, the US dollar, and by extension every major currency in the world, was no longer a claim on a real, tangible asset. It became what is known as fiat currency. Its value was based on nothing but government decree. Fiat. Let it be done. It was backed only by faith in the institution that issued it. The anchor was gone. The world was now financially afloat, sailing into an unknown and unpredictable future. The decision made on that August night was not a historical footnote. It was the Big Bang that created the financial universe we inhabit today. The consequences of that temporary suspension are all around us, embedded in the very fabric of our modern lives. The most immediate effect was the unshackling of debt. With money no longer tied to a finite resource like gold, there was no longer a hard limit on how much of it could be created. For governments, this was a dream come true. Deficit spending, once constrained, became the norm. Total U.S. national debt in 1971 was under $400 billion. Today, it is over $34 trillion, an increase of more than 85 times. This pattern repeated itself across the globe, creating a planetary addiction to debt. For the financial industry, it was the beginning of a golden age. The new system of floating exchange rates and unlimited credit creation turned Wall Street from a supporting actor into the main character of the global economy. A world of complex derivatives, speculative bubbles, and financial innovation was born. Making money from money became vastly more profitable than making actual things. The real economy of manufacturing and services was slowly eclipsed by a financialized economy that produced nothing but volatility. The system became inherently unstable. Without an anchor, the world was subjected to ever-increasing cycles of boom and bust. The Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, the Asian financial crisis of the 1990s, the dot-com bust of 2000, and the great global financial crisis of 2008, which brought the entire system to the brink of collapse. Each time, the solution was the same: create more money. lower interest rates, bail out the failing institutions. The very freedom that was supposed to create stability only created larger and more dangerous bubbles. And perhaps most profoundly, the post-1971 system has been a primary driver of wealth inequality. When new money is created, it does not enter the economy evenly. It is injected through the banking system. Those closest to the spigot, the banks, large corporations, and the already wealthy who own financial assets, get it first. They get to spend it before it has circulated widely and caused prices to rise. This is known as the Cantillon effect. It is a hidden tax on savers and wage earners. It is a slow, relentless transfer of wealth from the bottom and middle to the very top. The forgotten law that was broken in 1971 isn't just a matter of economics. It is the silent operating system behind the widening social and political divisions we see today. We are all living in the shadow of Camp David, whether we know it or not. For 50 years, we have been living inside a grand monetary experiment. An experiment based on the idea that human wisdom, embodied in central banks and governments, can manage a system of infinite credit better than the old, rigid discipline of a physical anchor. We have been taught to trust the experts, to believe in the system. But the results of this experiment are becoming clear. A world drowning in unpayable debt. An economy that lurches from one crisis to the next. And a society where the gap between the haves and the have-nots has grown to a breaking point. The broken promise of 1971 raises a fundamental question. What is value? In a world where money can be created from thin air, in limitless quantities, what is truly scarce? What is real? Perhaps the real value is not in the paper promises issued by governments, but in things that cannot be printed, the skills we cultivate, the businesses we build, the communities we nurture, the time we spend with those we love. The search for an alternative anchor has already begun. Some look to the past, arguing for a return to the discipline of gold. Others look to the future, to new technologies like Bitcoin, a decentralized digital asset with a finite supply, created to be an alternative to the fiat system. We do not know how this experiment will end. Will it collapse under the weight of its own contradictions? Or will it be reformed, replaced by something new? But one thing is certain. The invisible architecture that governs our lives is more fragile than we think. It is built not on gold or laws, but on a single, delicate commodity: trust. And when trust is gone, the entire structure can come crashing down. The forgotten law of 1971 is a reminder that the systems we take for granted are not forces of nature. They are human creations. They are choices. And if we want a different future, we must first understand the choices that created our present.